right now, as you're watching this, one of the most critical shipping corridors on Earth has gone completely silent. I'm talking about a waterway so vital that roughly one-fifth of all the oil consumed on this planet passes through it every single day. And in the span of just a few hours, that artery of global commerce transformed from a bustling highway of supertankers into an eerie graveyard of stranded vessels. What I'm about to share with you isn't just another headline about tension in the Middle East. This is a story about how quickly the entire global energy system can be brought to its knees, about the invisible workers trapped in the middle of a war zone, and about one country that quietly built an escape route while everyone else remained dependent on a single, vulnerable choke point. The consequences of what's happening right now are already spreading across continents. And by the time I finish explaining this situation, you'll understand why fuel prices in your neighborhood are climbing and why the next few months could reshape the entire geopolitical landscape of energy. I want to take you straight to the heart of this crisis, and that means starting with the Strait of Hormuz. For those unfamiliar with this narrow passage, let me paint a picture for you. The Strait of Hormuz is a slender waterway that connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and, ultimately, to the open waters of the Arabian Sea. It sits between Iran on one side and the United Arab Emirates and Oman on the other. Under normal circumstances, this corridor functions as the main artery through which Middle Eastern oil and liquefied natural gas reach the rest of the world. We're talking about approximately 100 tankers passing through this strait every single day, carrying crude oil and gas toward refineries in Asia, Europe, and North America. The geography alone makes this strait irreplaceable. There simply is no alternative route for the massive quantities of energy that flow from the Gulf region. When tensions rise in this area, the entire global economy holds its breath, and right now, that breath has been held for far too long. The conflict surrounding Iran has escalated to a point where commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz has essentially ceased. Military threats, naval confrontations, and the sheer unpredictability of the situation have driven shipping companies to withdraw their vessels from the region. Insurance companies, recognizing the astronomical risks involved, have either raised premiums to prohibitive levels or withdrawn coverage altogether. Without insurance, commercial voyages become financially impossible, even for operators willing to gamble with their crews and cargo. The result is a complete shutdown of one of the busiest maritime routes on the planet. According to maritime tracking data, roughly 200 tankers now sit trapped in the strait and the surrounding Gulf waters. These aren't small fishing boats or cargo vessels carrying consumer goods. These are massive supertankers, each one carrying millions of barrels of crude oil that cannot move toward the markets desperately waiting for them. The economic implications of this paralysis extend far beyond the Middle East. Every barrel of oil trapped on those tankers represents fuel that won't reach refineries, gasoline that won't fill tanks, and heating oil that won't warm homes. The ripple effects are already visible in energy markets around the world. I've been covering global affairs for years, and I can tell you that what distinguishes this crisis from previous tensions in the region is the totality of the shutdown. We've seen threats before. We've seen brief disruptions and diplomatic standoffs. But I cannot recall a moment when tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz came to such a complete halt. The vessels that attempted to navigate the corridor in the early hours of the conflict quickly found themselves in impossible situations. Explosions lit up the sky. Military aircraft roared overhead. Communication systems began failing as GPS signals disappeared and satellite links faltered. Ship captains received contradictory orders, first to stop loading cargo, then to resume operations despite the chaos unfolding around them. The confusion and danger have created an atmosphere where no reasonable shipping company would risk sending additional vessels into the region. And so the tankers that were already there when the conflict intensified remain trapped, their crews waiting in darkness while a war unfolds around them. This is not a temporary inconvenience. This is a fundamental rupture in the global energy supply chain, and the consequences will be felt for months to come. I want to shift our focus now to something that rarely makes headlines, but sits at the very center of this crisis. I'm talking about the seafarers, the men and women who operate these massive tankers and who now find themselves stranded in one of the most dangerous regions on Earth. When we discuss oil prices and geopolitical tensions, We often forget that human beings are physically present in these conflict zones, doing their jobs while missiles fly and explosions illuminate the night sky. These workers come from all over the world, many from countries like India and the Philippines, where maritime employment represents a crucial source of income for entire families. They signed contracts expecting routine voyages across familiar shipping lanes. Instead, they now sit aboard vessels that cannot move, watching military aircraft pass overhead and wondering whether the next explosion will be closer than the last. The maritime industry depends entirely on these workers, yet they remain largely invisible during moments of crisis. I believe we owe them our attention, and I want to share what I've learned about their current situation. One crew member aboard a crude tanker currently trapped in the Gulf described the moment the crisis began unfolding. The vessel was in the process of loading oil at an industrial facility somewhere in the region when explosions suddenly lit up the distant sky. Orders immediately came to halt the loading process as the situation deteriorated. Then, hours later, contradictory instructions arrived telling the crew to resume filling the ship despite the obvious dangers nearby. The tanker eventually took on more than 1 million barrels of crude oil while chaos surrounded it. What strikes me most about this account is the surreal quality of the experience. Here you have workers continuing routine operations, filling tanks and monitoring gauges, while a major military conflict explodes around them. GPS signals disappeared, making navigation impossible. Communication systems faltered, cutting the crew off from reliable contact with the outside world. And yet they continued their work because that's what seafarers do. They follow orders and trust that someone somewhere has a plan to get them home safely. That trust is now being tested in ways that no training program could have prepared them for. The vessel I just described now sits motionless in the Gulf with more than 20 seafarers aboard. They have enough food and desalinated water to sustain themselves for approximately 60 days, although rationing may become necessary if the shutdown extends beyond current expectations. The crew sends periodic messages to their employer and to their families, brief communications that amount to little more than confirmation that everyone remains alive. Limited internet access and disrupted satellite signals make even these simple exchanges difficult. Family members back home wait anxiously for each message, knowing that the person they love is trapped in a war zone with no clear path to safety. I've read accounts from multiple vessels, and the pattern repeats across the region. Crews watching explosions flash across the sky, hearing fighter jets roar overhead, and continuing their duties while hoping that the violence doesn't reach their ship. Some tankers sit anchored near the coast of Dubai, where the situation remains relatively stable. Others are scattered throughout the Gulf in positions far more exposed to potential attack. Each vessel represents not just millions of barrels of crude oil, but also dozens of human beings whose lives depend on decisions made by governments and military commanders thousands of miles away. International maritime unions have begun receiving urgent messages from sailors trapped across the region. The International Transport Workers Federation, which represents more than 1.2 million maritime workers globally, now faces enormous pressure to help crew members who suddenly find themselves in an impossible situation. The Federation's leadership has made clear that seafarers are civilians performing essential work, not combatants who accepted the risks of warfare. Yet extracting these workers from the region presents logistical challenges that seem almost insurmountable. Ship owners have warned that the surrounding waters currently represent a no-go zone for any vessel movement. Sending replacement crews into an active conflict zone would require workers willing to accept extraordinary risks simply to board a tanker. Evacuating current crew members would require safe passage through waters where at least 6 vessels have already been attacked and at least 2 seafarers have lost their lives. The mathematics of rescue operations in this environment simply don't work in anyone's favor. And so these workers wait, rationing their supplies when necessary, maintaining their equipment, and sending messages home while the world debates oil prices and geopolitical strategy. I find it important to remember that behind every headline about energy markets, there are human beings caught in circumstances entirely beyond their control, doing their best to survive until someone finds a way to bring them home. I need to walk you through the economic consequences of this disruption because the numbers involved are staggering and the effects will reach consumers in virtually every country on Earth. When a shipping corridor carrying roughly 20% of the global oil supply suddenly stops functioning, markets react with predictable intensity. Prices climb rapidly as buyers scramble to secure alternative sources. Supply chains that appeared stable just weeks ago reveal their hidden vulnerabilities. And countries that built their economies around cheap, reliable energy from the Middle East now face difficult questions about how they'll keep their refineries operating and their populations supplied with fuel. The Strait of Hormuz shutdown isn't a localized problem affecting only the nations bordering the Persian Gulf. This is a global event with implications for every economy connected to international energy markets, which means essentially every economy on the planet. I've spent considerable time analyzing how different regions are responding to this crisis, and what I've found suggests that the disruption will reshape energy relationships for years to come. The fundamental problem facing global markets right now is simple mathematics. Approximately one-fifth of all oil consumed worldwide normally transits through the Strait of Hormuz. That volume cannot be replaced overnight, and in many cases, it cannot be replaced at all through existing infrastructure. Countries that previously received the majority of their oil via tankers passing through the strait must now secure supplies from alternative sources, but those sources have limited capacity to increase production and limited infrastructure to deliver additional barrels to distant markets. The result is intense competition for whatever oil remains available outside the conflict zone. Benchmark prices have already begun climbing toward $100 per barrel as traders anticipate extended shortages. Every dollar added to the price of crude oil eventually translates into higher costs for consumers, whether at gasoline stations, in heating bills, or in the prices of goods transported by diesel-powered trucks and ships. The economic pain from this crisis will not remain confined to energy markets. It will spread through every sector that depends on affordable fuel, which means virtually every sector of the modern economy. I want to highlight several countries facing particularly acute pressure as a result of this shutdown. India stands near the top of that list because the nation imports approximately 90% of its oil, and a significant portion of those imports traditionally arrived via tankers passing through the Strait of Hormuz. With a population of 1.4 billion people and fewer than 10 days of emergency reserves available in storage, India faces an urgent need to secure alternative supplies before the situation deteriorates further. Government officials in New Delhi have reportedly begun reaching out to any producer capable of delivering crude quickly, recognizing that allowing energy supplies to collapse would trigger economic and social consequences that no government could survive. Japan presents a similar case because the island nation imports nearly all of its energy resources and depends entirely on maritime routes to keep refineries operating. Any disruption to those supply lines threatens not just economic stability, but the basic functioning of Japanese society. South Korea, another major energy importer, watches the situation with equal concern. European nations that spent years reducing dependence on Russian gas now worry that Middle Eastern supplies may prove equally unreliable over the long term. The crisis in the Strait of Hormuz has exposed a fundamental vulnerability in the global energy system, and governments everywhere are reassessing their assumptions about supply security. What makes this particular moment so significant is the combination of immediate crisis and long-term implications. The immediate crisis involves trapped tankers, stranded crews, and rapidly rising prices. But the long-term implications may prove even more consequential because this shutdown has revealed just how fragile the traditional energy supply chain actually is. Countries that previously assumed Middle Eastern oil would always flow freely through the Strait of Hormuz are now confronting the reality that a single geopolitical flashpoint can disrupt supplies for weeks or months at a time. That realization will drive investment decisions, diplomatic relationships, and energy policies for decades to come. I believe we're witnessing a turning point in how the world thinks about energy security. The old model assumed that stability in the Middle East could be maintained indefinitely, and that the major shipping corridors would remain open regardless of regional conflicts. That assumption has proven catastrophically wrong, and the consequences are already reshaping global markets in ways that will persist long after the current crisis eventually resolves. Now I want to turn our attention to a country that finds itself in a remarkably advantageous position during this crisis, and that country is Canada. While tankers sit trapped in the Strait of Hormuz and global markets scramble for alternative supplies, Canadian energy exports continue flowing through routes that pass nowhere near the chaos unfolding in the Middle East. This isn't an accident or a stroke of luck. Canada spent years building the infrastructure necessary to access global markets independently, and those investments are now paying extraordinary dividends. The pipelines, terminals, and shipping corridors that Canada constructed over the past decade provide an escape route from the vulnerabilities that have paralyzed other producers. I find this story particularly compelling because it illustrates how strategic planning and infrastructure investment can position a country to thrive during exactly the kind of disruption we're witnessing today. Let me walk you through what Canada built and why it matters so much in the current environment. The centerpiece of Canada's Pacific export capacity is a major pipeline connecting Alberta's oil sands to terminals on the coast of British Columbia. This corridor now transports approximately 890,000 barrels of crude oil each day towards shipping facilities where tankers can head west across the Pacific Ocean. The expansion of this pipeline nearly tripled Canada's capacity to move oil toward the Pacific coast, transforming what was once a bottleneck into a major gateway for international exports. From Canada's Pacific terminals, tankers can reach Asian markets in roughly 10 days, which represents about half the transit time required for Middle Eastern cargo traveling the traditional route when the Strait of Hormuz remains open. In the current situation, of course, the Middle Eastern route cannot operate at all, making Canadian supplies even more attractive to buyers throughout Asia. The infrastructure that many observers dismissed as unnecessary just a few years ago has suddenly become one of the most strategically valuable energy assets on the planet. Countries searching desperately for reliable oil supplies outside the conflict zone are discovering that Canada offers exactly what they need, delivered through routes that avoid every major geopolitical choke point. Canada's energy advantages extend well beyond crude oil. The country also controls enormous natural gas reserves that are now accessible to international markets through newly constructed liquefied natural gas facilities. A major LNG terminal on the coast of British Columbia represents the largest private investment in Canadian history, with construction costs approaching $40 billion. That facility has already begun shipping LNG cargo toward Asian markets, operating at a capacity capable of supporting roughly 170 tanker shipments annually when running at full output. South Korea has already established long-term purchase agreements for Canadian LNG, creating a direct energy link that bypasses all the geopolitical tensions surrounding Middle Eastern gas supplies. This combination of oil and natural gas exports positions Canada as a comprehensive energy supplier capable of meeting multiple needs simultaneously. Countries worried about the reliability of traditional suppliers now have a North American alternative that operates entirely outside the volatile regions where conflicts repeatedly disrupt commerce. The value of that alternative has never been clearer than it is at this precise moment. I should also mention the scale of Canadian energy reserves, because the numbers help explain why this country can sustain large export volumes over extended periods. Canadian proven oil reserves total approximately 163 billion barrels, placing the country fourth in the world behind only Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. Production levels approach 6 million barrels per day when counting conventional oil along with output from Alberta's massive oil sands operations. These figures mean Canada can supply a significant portion of international demand without relying on any shipping lanes that cross conflict zones. The oil sands operations alone employ more than 150,000 workers directly, while supporting hundreds of thousands of additional jobs throughout the supply chain. Rising oil prices increase royalty payments to provincial governments and expand investment across communities connected to the industry. What we're witnessing is a transformation of Canada's position in global energy markets. A country that previously sold the overwhelming majority of its crude to a single customer, the United States, now possesses the infrastructure to reach buyers across the Pacific and potentially across the Atlantic as well. That transformation required billions of dollars in investment and years of construction, but the timing could not have been more fortunate for Canadian producers. I want to conclude by examining what this crisis means for the future of global energy relationships and why the shifts occurring right now may prove permanent rather than temporary. The shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz has forced countries around the world to confront vulnerabilities they previously preferred to ignore. Governments that assumed Middle Eastern oil would always flow freely are now scrambling to secure alternative supplies, and the relationships they forged during this crisis will likely persist long after shipping eventually resumes through the strait. Canada finds itself at the center of this realignment because the country offers something that very few others can match at this moment: large energy reserves accessible through secure routes that avoid every major geopolitical flashpoint. India presents perhaps the most dramatic example of how this crisis is creating new energy partnerships. The country imports roughly 90% of its oil and previously relied heavily on shipments passing through the Strait of Hormuz. With fewer than 10 days of emergency reserves available, Indian officials face intense pressure to secure new suppliers immediately. Reports indicate that during recent diplomatic conversations, Indian representatives told their Canadian counterparts that India would purchase whatever Canada is willing to offer. That statement reflects the desperation of a country with 1.4 billion people watching its energy supplies threatened by a distant conflict beyond its control. Japan and South Korea represent additional markets where Canadian energy exports are gaining traction during this crisis. Japan imports nearly all of its energy resources and depends on maritime routes to keep its economy functioning. The reliability concerns raised by the Strait of Hormuz shutdown will likely drive Japanese buyers toward suppliers capable of delivering through secure corridors. South Korea has already established a foothold in Canadian energy markets through long-term LNG purchases, and that relationship now appears remarkably strategic given the uncertainty surrounding Middle Eastern gas supplies. I believe we're witnessing the early stages of a fundamental restructuring of global energy trade, driven by the realization that supply security matters as much as price when evaluating potential partners. The transformation of Canada's energy sector from a regional supplier primarily serving the United States into a global exporter reaching markets across the Pacific represents one of the most significant developments in international energy over the past decade. The current crisis will eventually end, and shipping through the Strait of Hormuz will eventually resume. But the relationships forged during this period of uncertainty may prove far more durable than the crisis itself. Canada has positioned itself to benefit from this shift in ways that will shape the country's economy and its international relationships for generations to come.